Greetings, this is Dr. John Wineland once again with another Restoration History lecture for you, topic. This time we're going to look at big issues of the 20th century. Many of them, of course, began in the 19th century, but they come to a real focal point in the 20th century, which unfortunately is going to lead to division between different groups and different understandings. So I've just entitled this 20th Century Developments. So let's take a look at these 20th century developments. There are three main issues that are going to create problems in the 20th century. These issues begin in the 19th century, but they come to full fruition, I guess we might say, or division in the 20th century. The first of these is instrumental music. This may not be something that you even consider. I don't know what your background is, but the idea of being able to use instruments in a worship service, whether that be a piano, guitar, or whatever else, this became a divisive issue in the late 19th and certainly by the early 20th century. Another is really more, I suppose you might say, philosophical or intellectual, and this is liberalism. Liberalism, which takes the view of the Bible that it's not accurate, that it's not to be taken literally, these sorts of things. Liberalism then will certainly be there in the 19th century, but it's going to lead to a lot of problems in the 20th century. And as kind of an outgrowth of some of that will be the idea of open membership. So we'll talk more about that, but open membership would basically mean you could transfer to a church. What do they do where you attend? If somebody wants to come, they've moved into town or whatever, they come to your church and they say they want to join. What kind of questions do you ask them? And what are your requirements for them to become members of your congregation? Well, open membership would just accept anyone who said they had been a member at any church, any group, any denomination. You can come and fellowship. Well, let's take a look at instrumental music. This is a big topic, but one that we'll have to summarize here. It ends up being a cause for division. As we've mentioned, it's basically the idea, should you be allowed to use instruments during the worship service? Are instruments allowed? And this is really also comes down to a kind of interpretive or hermeneutical principles of what should be done. It certainly has already become an issue by, let's say, 1850 or so. And by the end of the 19th century, it's a major controversy. And we'll see in the early 20th century that the U.S. religious census will list in separate groups those who don't use instruments from those who do. So again, since this is not a denomination, there's no headquarters, there's nobody to make this decision. But the U.S. religious census, as it's going through and saying, well, there's really two groups here, it's not just one. So it was an outside sort of government agency that recognized that this issue had become so divisive that there really were two groups. They were functioning as two groups. So did they split? Well, I guess, but it's not a official sort of thing. But it had been happening for a long time, probably for at least 50 years. And then those with using the instruments were called the disciples of Christ. Or maybe we should say the disciples of Christ were identified as the ones that used instruments. And then those that did not use instruments were called the churches of Christ. Now, sometimes people call them Church of Christ non-instrumental. And this can be confusing for some because if you're in the southern part of the United States and you see a sign that says Church of Christ, I would say most of the time, I won't say 100%, but in the 90 percentile category, that means that that church, if you went into that congregation on a Sunday morning, they would not be using any instruments during worship. Okay? But and typically, if it said Christian church today, it could be a Disciples of Christ. They usually have a logo of a chalice with a cross on it. Or the Christian church could mean that it is an independent Christian church that uses instruments. Now, in the sort of the Midwest, or in the sort of the buffer zone there, we might call it, you will find churches that are called Church of Christ that use instruments, and those that are Church of Christ who don't use instruments. This can lead to confusion. I was preaching at a church in Huntington, West Virginia for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. And it was called a Church of Christ, High Lawn Church of Christ in Huntington, West Virginia. And about, I don't know, let's say 5 or 6 blocks away, there was another Church of Christ. And that Church of Christ was non-instrumental Church of Christ. And so I heard stories about someone, who was coming to fill in and preach at the High Lawn Church of Christ, and they walked into the other Church of Christ to preach, and they didn't know they were in the wrong place, and the service had already started, and so the guy who was going to preach just walked right up to the front. He sat down on in a chair up there, and they kept continuing, and then he kind of looked around. He suddenly realized he didn't belong there. He got up and he walked out the door. He got in his car and took off, and I think he eventually found the High Lawn Church of Christ. Likewise, one morning, the High Lawn Church of Christ had a very large auditorium. The membership had declined, and so there weren't a lot of people there on a Sunday morning. And so I was greeting people at the door, and a couple comes in I'd never seen before, so I welcomed them. They were very friendly. And they walked past me. Then they had to turn to the right to enter the auditorium there for service. And as they stood in that doorway, they looked. I saw the look on their face was of shock, perhaps of horror, that they saw up in the front of the church a piano and an organ. And they looked at each other. And then they quickly walked out and left. Never came back. My guess was they were looking for the non-instrumental Church of Christ, and they got confused. I wanted to tell them, hey, come back. We're non-instrumental by default. No one at the church played the piano or the organ during the worship service. But just the mere fact that it was there indicated to them that this was a different kind of a church, and they were shocked, because I've met a lot of people from the South who believe that any church that says it's Church of Christ does not use instruments. Well, I guess that couple found out that day, and hopefully they found the place where they wanted to go. Well, anyway, this shows you this can be a divisive issue. It really comes down to an interpretive issue. If something's not mentioned in the Bible, is that a prohibition? If we can't find an example where they used instruments in New Testament worship, does that mean we are prohibited from using instruments? That sort of hermeneutical principle is really what's at the heart of it. Well, it becomes a bitter and divisive issue, and I suppose in some ways it still is today. There's still great division over this. Maybe it's mellowed for some, but not for all, that's for sure. I put this picture of a cow up here because Alexander Campbell, you might wonder, where did he come down on this? Well, he wrote in 1851 these words: "To all spiritually minded Christian, such aids would be as a cowbell in a concert." Here he's talking about using an instrument in worship. He was opposed to using instruments in worship. Moses Lard, another early Restoration leader, wrote, it would be better to live out of a church than to go into such a den with an instrument. That's probably what that couple was thinking as he turned and saw those instruments. We got to get out of here. We got to go out of this place. We can't be in this den, I suppose. Sort of making a offhand reference to the phrase den of iniquity, perhaps. I don't know. At any rate, what is the pro side? Why should you have instruments in worship? I am imagining most of you come from congregations where they use instruments, so you haven't really thought about this as an issue before, perhaps. But many say, it's expedience. It's expedient to use it. We need the instruments to aid us in worship. They put us in a mindset of that. They help us sing the songs, all that sort of thing. So it's an expedient thing to have instruments, even though it's not specifically commanded, nor do we have an example of it. But we also do not have a prohibition. It doesn't say, you shall not use instruments in worship. Perhaps that's in 2 Opinions 3:9. But no, it's not in there. Now, of course, if we look in the Old Testament, it's very clear that the Jews in their Old Testament worship used instruments. And so we see that, these drums, bells, and so forth, different things. We also, of course, see that in say, Revelation, that in heaven, there are instruments that are being used. There's trumpets and things like that. So you can look that up for yourself, Revelation 5 and Revelation 14. And I'm sure you might be able to find other examples. Well, it violates no command. We are commanded to sing, and playing the instrument does not violate that command. So it doesn't void the command to sing, and in fact, many see it as an aid to singing. When this came up, one of the early proponents of this was a man by the name of L.L. Pinkerton. Interesting guy. L.L. Pinkerton was a minister at a church in Midway, Kentucky. And evidently their singing was so bad at Midway, Kentucky, that they would get people to come on Saturday and practice the songs that they were going to sing. The congregation. They would want as many as possible to show up on Saturday and practice so that on Sunday it would go better. And finally one day, I think one of the ladies of the congregation said, well, I have a melodeon at home. If we brought the melodeon here, we could play out the notes, and that might help us sing the song. And so they brought the melodeon in, and yes, sure enough, it helped them practice the song. And then they said, well, why don't we just use it on Sunday mornings? And so they were now introducing the melodeon, which is sort of like a piano, cross between a piano and kind of an organ. It's a pedal piano. Anyway, they began to use it there, and that was a huge controversy and was roundly condemned by many and defended by L.L. Pinkerton. So that was really, I think, for expedience to try to help them sing better. Well, what about against it? Why would anyone be against using instruments in worship, you might say? Well, they say it's an innovation. We don't see it in the New Testament. And so if we bring in innovations, who knows what's going to happen, right? So since it's not there, there's no evidence of this being used in apostolic times. It doesn't say to play. It says to sing. It doesn't say to not. It says it doesn't have any command to play and sing, only to sing. So if you're going to play and sing or use instruments, this is an innovation. So basically their interpretive idea is, unless there's an express command, okay, we're told to do it, play instruments, or an approved precedent, that is, Paul is writing to the Ephesians, and he says, well, in your worship service, as you've been playing instruments and singing, something like that, an aside, or something where you find an incident where it happens. It shouldn't happen. So basically the idea here is an interpretive issue. And if I could summarize that interpretive issue, which of course is always dangerous when you make it too short, but basically silence equals prohibition. If we don't have a command to do it, if we don't have an example of it being done, then we shouldn't be doing it. It's an innovation. And so some are very strongly opposed to using instruments in worship. Now, what passages are used by those who oppose instrumental music? They point to Ephesians 5:19, for example, or here is a command. It says, speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music in your heart. Okay, so again, no mention of instruments, but mention of singing and so forth. Colossians 3:16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, and as you sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. Okay, again, no mention of drums or guitars or other such things. Now, others say, well, this is not referring to public worship, but to personal admonitions of our worship. Okay. I think one thing I should mention here is that the use of the piano, and this doesn't really come up in this, but the use of the piano was controversial in part because of the history of the instrument. If you're on the frontier, let's say in Kentucky, or in rural western part of Virginia, West Virginia, bringing a piano over the mountains was not your first priority. So there were very few pianos early on, any kind of instruments that would come. And the only pianos that did make it across the mountains, guess where they were used? They were used in bars, taverns, honky-tonks, dance halls. All of these things were associated with behavior that many felt was not befitting of a good Christian. So the piano was identified, whereas today you may identify a piano as like, very traditional, very conservative. People that if you went into a worship service and they only used a piano, you might think, oh, these people are backwards. They don't have a praise band. They don't have guitars and drums and synthesizers, keyboards and stuff. But at that time, the piano was a symbol of a honky-tonk kind of thing. And so that's in part why it was rejected, the piano. And I think a similar thing has happened, again, something not within your experience probably, but the same kind of ideas when people wanted to start to use guitars in worship. Guitars were identified with sort of hippies, rock music, folk festivals, a lot of behavior, drug use, and so forth. And so bringing a guitar into church and using it to sing a song was at first quite controversial. I'm sure it's not that controversial to most of you today, but it certainly was at that time. So I think that's another sort of cultural part of this that's there. There is the interpretive, hermeneutical thing, but it's also a cultural thing. Well, there have been reconciliation attempts between those who don't use instruments and those who do. Several have attempted to reconcile those two groups, that is, the group that uses instruments and the group that doesn't. A man by the name of James Murch, who wrote an early book, textbook that was used by many called Christians Only about the Restoration Movement. He set up unity movements in the 1930s, 37, 38, to try to bring them together. A unity quarterly began in 1943. So, there has been interaction between the non-instrumental, if we want to call it that, Church of Christ, and the Christian Church, Church of Christ. These began as early as the late 1930s, 1940s. In the 1950s, Ernest Beam began some unity meetings. In the 1960s, Carl Ketcherside did. In the 1980s, Don DeWelt, connected with Ozark College, Ozark Bible College at that time, be pushed for this. The Unity forums are still out there. They still meet. I've been to a couple of them. Limited success, but there has been cooperation on certain things. Like, for example, College Press Commentary Series has had both non-instrumental and instrumental scholars write commentaries for the College Press Commentary Series. There's been some other interactions too at different conferences and different meetings. Okay, so the talk is still out there. I guess I would say it has limited success, but at least there's conversation between the groups there. All right? And I think in many cases, somewhat better than it had been in the past. Another really divisive issue is going to be liberalism. Liberalism grows in the 19th century. It really starts in Europe, and many of the professors are trained, professors at universities, colleges, and seminaries are trained in Europe or trained by people who were trained in Europe, and so liberalism begins to grow. It's related to Darwinism. Charles Darwin's theory began to call into question the idea of the origin of the species, as he would say, the validity of Genesis and that sort of thing. And then modern science, sort of conflict with science and evolution. But it also led to a more internal criticism, one that we might call higher criticism of the Bible. It would basically say the Bible was not authored by those that you may assume it was authored by. It was authored by a committee of people. It was sort of authored through a long process of editorial work. And this was more an internal criticism, where those who had a more liberal view began to criticize the Bible themselves. They claim that they are Christians and that they're working with the church and that they want that to be. But it's not an outside attack, but they're attacking the Bible, which of course is the authority. And they would say, for example, the Old Testament is a patchwork of sources, sort of put together at a much later time. Same with the New Testament. And then they began to challenge the basic beliefs of Christianity, the miracles of the Bible, the virgin birth of Christ, even the resurrection of Christ would come into question, because all miracles came under scrutiny. And I think the key to this is they see the Bible as a book of human origin, not divine origin. Human authorship, not divine authorship. And they also began to see Christianity as just one of many religions. So as these ideas are percolating there, and they're coming up into the training of those who are church leaders, ministers, and they begin to preach these ideas, teach these ideas in the congregation, we start to see a lot of problems emerge, and division eventually comes. So what are some of the teachings of liberalism? Well, I've alluded to, I guess, already. Teachings of liberalism include rejecting miracles. Many would reject Christ really as being God in the flesh or divine. They would say, well, he was a great, great teacher, a great, great person, but not divine. They would argue that the church should evolve. The church needs to evolve and change with the times. And they sort of substitute the gospel message with what comes to be called the social gospel message. What is the social gospel? The social gospel would see sin as not breaking God's laws that are written in the Bible or whatever, but sin is really ignorance and poverty. That's what is sin. So we need to eliminate people's ignorance. We need to educate them. We need to attempt to eliminate their poverty so they can live a better life. It also comes down to the idea that they believe that basically every person is basically good. And that since everyone's basically good, well, You don't really need the gospel. You see, you don't need a savior if you don't have a sinner. You don't need to be saved from your sins if you're really not a sinner. And that sort of was their message. The real sin in people's lives is just they didn't understand, and that poverty had driven them to a lifestyle that, we find unacceptable by many. Well, everyone's basically good. And so how do we overcome that? We overcome that by education, educating people, and then redistributing wealth. In other words, kind of like Robin Hood, take from the rich and give to the poor. This becomes the social gospel in a nutshell. You can see it illustrated in an interesting little book. I don't know if you've ever read it, which I think it's worth reading. It's called In His Steps by Charles Sheldon. And that's where we get the little sticker. Perhaps you've seen WWJD, What Would Jesus Do? Because that was the title of his book. Now, unfortunately, or maybe that's the way he intended it, Charles Sheldon never copyrighted his work, so anybody can print it without paying any money. And so you can also market things like WWJD or What Would Jesus Do? Because again, he didn't ever copyright any of that. He wrote this book now well over 100 years ago in 1896, In His Steps, WWJD, What Would Jesus Do? And that's a kind of a sort of social gospel light. I mean, yes, we need to be concerned about people's life and about them being hungry and these kinds of things. But the social gospel begins to ignore salvation, really, issues and the idea of sin and sinners. And they begin to focus on more political things like social justice, labor unions, some of them pushing the prohibition of alcohol because that brought bad social things, like, for example, husbands who would get drunk and spend all the money for the family and perhaps mistreat their wife or their family. So they began to tie, really, it ends up tying salvation to good works. They argue that people must emulate the life of Jesus. And that's pretty much it. It's not accepting him really as divine Savior, but accepting him as the ultimate example of what they should do. And I would even submit that what they argue is the essence of what Jesus would do doesn't always really follow, I think, what Jesus would do. But that's a whole nother discussion, maybe for another time. Now, the liberalism that we see there is going to make its way into the colleges first and seminaries, and that's sort of the training of ministers. Then it will make its way into the congregations. So liberalism begins in Europe in the 19th century. It's introduced to colleges and universities, seminaries, and so forth, where they're training people who will become ministers and church leaders in the United States in the late 19th century. And we see, for example, real centers of this would be Yale University, which, by the way, had been started originally to train ministers, and the University of Chicago, which likewise was started by a Baptist, really, a lot of it was. And that's in 1892. So many ministers then and educators are trained at these colleges. When they graduate, when they go out into the congregations to preach and teach and so forth, and to the schools, they begin teaching these ideas. So how does that make its way then to the Restoration Movement, the RM, as I call it up here? The Restoration Movement, well, one of the things that will happen is at the University of Chicago, where they have the Disciples Divinity House at the University of Chicago. That's what I mean by UC, University of Chicago. In 1894, the Disciples Divinity House is formed, and it's a kind of hotbed of liberalism there. And the Campbell Institute is started in 1896, once again, quite liberal theologically. A journal will start called the Christian Oracle, and later the name is changed to the Christian Century. And I believe that journal is still around today, at least it was a few years ago. Colleges were then staffed by professors that were trained in this school of thought. And remember, in the Restoration Movement, we've had a long history of a lot of colleges. And I don't have time to list them all for you. But this kind of thing is there. For example, I'll just give you one example. In Lexington, Kentucky, we had the College of the Bible, as it was called. This was kind of an outgrowth of Bacone College when it moves to Lexington, becomes College of the Bible. It later becomes known today as, it was known as Transylvania College and now Transylvania University. And so we see a lot of controversy taking place at the College of the Bible over liberalism and the struggle by conservatives to hang on to this school. Well, the movement will divide, again, not officially, because there is no headquarters to do that, but we have two camps that develop. How's that? One is liberal, one is conservative. And so what happens then, the conservatives, in reaction to liberalism, decide that they need to form their own schools. And it's not just within the Restoration Movement. There is a Bible college movement that takes place because of the liberalism that is entrenched in many of these schools. This Bible college movement then is formed to be a conservative alternative to train ministers. And certainly that happens in the Restoration Movement as well. We can see that the earliest Bible colleges formed in the late 19th century, 1893, and so we'll divide that up to say to 1919. These are the early Bible colleges, which would include Johnson Bible College, now called Johnson University, which starts in 1893. Ashley Johnson begins that in Kimberlin Heights, Tennessee, near Knoxville. And we see Minnesota Bible College, later called Crossroads College, now defunct, will start in this period. Kentucky Christian College, now called Kentucky Christian University, started in 1919. And also fairly early on in this period, we could place it here, is Cincinnati Bible College, which had a direct connection to College of the Bible in Lexington. And of course, it's later called Cincinnati Christian University, now defunct. It went out of business a couple of years ago. Manhattan Christian College started early on here, and then also Pacific Christian College, now called Hope International University in 1928. Okay, so these are probably, I'm extending that a little bit from 1893 to about 1930. Okay, these are the earliest colleges in the Restoration Movement, but these are started in direct opposition to liberalism because there were plenty of other colleges around that will eventually now are aligned with the disciples of Christ who control them completely. Well, other Bible colleges begin, right, in the 1930s, as we've mentioned. Atlanta Christian College, now called Point University. San Jose Bible College in California, now called William Jessup University, and I think increasingly just Jessup University. In the 1940s and 50s, a whole host of them began here. Boise Bible College, Colegio Biblico, down in Texas to reach out to those who speak Spanish and those in Mexico. Great Lakes Christian College, Lincoln Christian College, which is going to be defunct in 2024. Louisville Christian College, Louisville Bible College, Midwest Christian College, defunct in 1985. Nebraska Christian College, defunct in 2020. Ozark Bible College, now Ozark Christian College. Roanoke Bible College, now Mid-Atlantic Christian University. Dallas Christian College. Puget Sound Christian College is now defunct by 2007. So we've lost a lot of colleges along the way, as there is at this time, it's difficult, especially for small colleges, to survive. In the 50s and the 60s, we see Central Christian College of the Bible, and then Eastern Christian College, which was I believe in Maryland, defunct in 2005. They kind of merged in with Roanoke Bible College at that time. Mid-South still exists in Memphis. Platte Valley, now Summit Christian College. St. Louis Christian College, now merged in with Central Christian College of the Bible in 2022. So there's a lot of movement here, but just a whole host of colleges. And some have shut down at different times, some have merged. This is all because of the financial problems that come with being a small college, especially today. Florida Christian College, formed in 1979, became a part of Johnson, Florida, or Johnson University, Florida, will be defunct in 2024. So, many, many colleges there. This is all motivated because the disciples of Christ and liberal theology takes over places like Butler College or Butler University, Hiram College, and goes on, actually. Okay? We don't have time to list all of them, right? There's 2 colleges in Canada, Restoration Movement, Maritime Christian College and Alberta Bible College. Pretty far apart in Canada, but both still there, both still active, both still pretty small. 2 for African Americans especially, Winston-Salem Bible College, which is now called Carolina Christian College, and College of the Scriptures in Louisville, Kentucky, which both start in 1945. 3 graduate schools develop. The 3 graduate schools that develop are Cincinnati Bible Seminary, later called Cincinnati Christian Seminary, and then later the whole thing's called Cincinnati Christian University, which of course is now defunct, no longer operating. Remnants of it have kind of merged in with Central Christian College of the Bible. Lincoln Christian Seminary was part of Lincoln Christian College. The seminary and the college are both closing in 2024. And in part, the graduate section, I guess, is going to sort of merge with Ozark. Emmanuel School of Religion had a lot of financial problems. They were right across the street from Milligan College, and so they've actually been absorbed or merged into the Milligan College system, and it's now called Emmanuel Christian Seminary. Okay. So there you go. This is a lot of schools for education. There are other conservative reactions. One of them is in missions. For example, the missionary societies, which had been started, were basically governed or controlled by liberals. And so in reaction to that, the conservative churches began to go to what's called direct support missions. And this might be what you are familiar with. Let's say you want to become a missionary somewhere. If you were at a church that is a denominational church, or even, say, with the Disciples of Christ, which is now a denomination, you couldn't just go do that on your own. You would have to go through the headquarters and say, I want to be a missionary to Ghana or someplace. And they would review you and they would say, well, what are your qualifications? We're going to have to consider this. And then if they did back you, they would also take monies that they have and help support you. Because in fact, as people in denominations give money in the collection plate on Sunday morning, a portion of that goes to the big headquarters, wherever the headquarters is, Indianapolis or someplace. And then they divvy out that money as they see fit. The conservative churches did not want to operate that way. They didn't want to go through these organizations that they felt could be controlled by liberals. And so this direct support would happen. Let's say you want to be a missionary to Ghana, then you would just start raising support. You would go around and talk to people that you knew. You would send out messages, letters, whatever, and tell people, this is my mission. This is what I want to do. I want you to support. Will you support me on a monthly basis? Will you send me $50 a month? Will you send me $100 a month? And then you start collecting the money until you get enough support per month that will support you and your family and to run this mission that you are going to try to accomplish in some foreign area. Well, a lot of that begins because of the liberal control of mission organizations. Okay? So we're going to see a whole host of missions in various parts of the world: Haiti, Africa, South America, other Caribbean areas, even places in Europe, places in Asia. They'll all be these sort of direct support missions. And so that would mean then the missionaries, those who are doing this, would have to come back periodically and report to the churches, go around and preach, and keep in touch with them. Well, also new periodicals are established as a result of this. The Christian Standard begins in 1866 to be a voice for those who were more conservative. The Christian Standard has had some tough times recently, but still exists today. You can still find the Christian Standard available to read today. A lot of it you can just look for it online. Another magazine journal is called the Restoration Herald, very conservative, starts in 1925, centered around the Cincinnati area. So was the Christian Standard originally. And then the North American Christian Convention also was centered in Cincinnati for many years. It began in 1927 to be a way to bring members of the churches together, to bring leaders together. It was never a official body that would make proclamations, and that's why it was more of an informational, more like a conference, I guess, than a convention. At any rate, it's ended now in 2018. It's been replaced really by a conference that's only designed for ministers now. It used to be designed for everyone. The North American was a huge event. Thousands and thousands of people would go. There would be preaching and singing and workshops and all sorts of things going on. It was also, that's where Bible Bowl began with the Christian churches. Bible Bowl was at the North American. A lot of that has been divided out now. The National Missionary Convention is now called ICOM, and you probably have heard of that. And now Bible Bowl has shifted over to ICOM. Well, Indianapolis, Indiana becomes the sort of center. Cincinnati and Indianapolis become big centers. Another thing that I should mention here is the development of what many people call Christian service camps. Not just a Christian camp, but the idea was that young people would come to these camps, and there they would be challenged to become a minister, to work with the church and that sort of thing. In 1939, these independent Christian service camps like Howes Mill and many others that maybe you've attended or visited in the past, had about 5,000 people, 5,000 young people going to these camps in 50 different weeks. And of course, that just continued to grow. By 1962, 36,000 young people were attending, and more than 36,000, and over 458 weeks of camp were there. Well, the focus was on evangelism. That is, many young people would be challenged to accept Christ at these camps, And also they would be challenged to serve in ministry at these camps, to become a missionary, a minister, or something like that. Commit to Christian service. So that's why many people call them Christian service camps. Well, the third issue, big issue that we talked about, was open membership. And this is kind of related, I think most people would relate it to sort of a more liberal stance, right? This is the practice of accepting those who are not immersed as members in the Christian church. In other words, when somebody comes forward on a Sunday at your congregation and wherever you worship, somebody says, I want to become a member of your congregation, what happens? What do they ask? What do they do? They just say, I want to join. You say, okay, sign up here. Sign up for our newsletter. You're a member. Most churches, most congregations have some sort of procedure that they would follow. And for many, they would want to know, okay, what's your background? Have you been baptized? Have you been immersed? When were you baptized? As an infant? So the whole question of baptism then relates to church membership. And so open membership would say if you were a member anywhere and you want to join, or even if you just want to join, it could go that far. But the pious unimmersed would be accepted, as they were called, as members. Usually non-Christians were required to be immersed. So this is mostly talking about transferring, what we might call transferring membership. But others can transfer their membership from groups that do not immerse. Oh, you're Presbyterian? You want to join our? Sure. You were baptized as an infant? Fine. You can be a member here. It's that question. Now, L. Pinkerton, the guy that I talked about with the instrumental, using instruments in worship, advocated open membership. This is why some have called him, he has been called, the first liberal of the Restoration movement, L. Pinkerton. But he advocates it. And it's now widely practiced in the 20th century, even in the 21st century. Certainly by 1929, we know 19 congregations are practicing it. In the 1940s, 120 congregations. It's hard to track. By 1948, 500 different congregations, and so forth. So it is a growing kind of thing. Okay, 3 groups will end up forming. Okay, some of you have in some of your writings have said, how could this be that we end up with 3 groups when we have this group that tries to teach unity? Well, I admit, unity is a tough thing. The first would be the struggle over music. That would lead to the non-instrumental group being divided by the U.S. religious census, and for all practical purposes are functioning on their own, and then those who use instruments are functioning on their own. So that means we have 2 groups then. Certainly, even before 1906, but certainly by 1906. Okay? Even the government recognizes it. The struggle over liberalism will lead in 1956 to the disciples of Christ wanting to form a denomination and have a denominational headquarters in Indianapolis, Indiana. And basically what they were saying is if you had the label Christian Church or Disciples of Christ on the sign out in front of your church, that congregation is ours. They have to join our denomination. In other words, we take control of your building. They take control of your assets, your vehicles, whatever, your instruments, whatever, the pews, everything you have is a part of the disciples of Christ. And we own it. So if you want to have a service, well, you're just going to have to pack up and leave, go get a building, find some land, start over. And so many congregations fight to remain independent. This went all the way to the Supreme Court of Indiana, where finally it was determined that each congregation could decide for themselves. They could sort of vote whether they wanted to be a part of the disciples of Christ or not. And that's where it ended. And that's why there was such strife, because this was arguing over the actual continuation of a congregation. And so it got pretty bitter. A lot of Christian churches in Indiana went all the way to the Supreme Court. After that, that kind of settled it, I think, elsewhere. Well, and of course, colleges will also be a way where you see a division. All the colleges, except for Bible colleges, will come under the control of the disciples of Christ. And so, in essence, the Christian church, Church of Christ, those in the center. So you might see on one side non-instrumental, on the other side disciples of Christ, and kind of in the middle, the Christian church, Churches of Christ, or the independent Churches of Christ, or independent Christian churches, had to start their own colleges. They already had, really, with the Bible colleges, but all the other colleges came under the control of the disciples' denomination, such as Butler College, now Butler University, and the Butler School of Religion, for example, which was one of the main seminaries. Well, I hope this gives you a little insight into some of the struggles of unity and some of the issues that really come. Instruments and liberalism is certainly part of it, open membership, and the education of ministers. Of course, this is all something that's very important and ends up becoming, unfortunately, divisive. Well, I hope you have a great day. Take care.